Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. My name is Gabriella Picton, and I am this episode's co-host alongside my colleague Josh Malm. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. In today's episode, Tim Addison joins us with retired Naval Captain Norman Jolin and Adam Lajeunesse to discuss the Naval Association of Canada's recent report, Canada in Extremis, Rebalancing the Canadian Armed Forces and Rebuilding the Canadian Navy. Reflecting on the evolution of the current global threat environment, their comments emphasize the necessity of rebuilding a strong and agile Canadian Navy to protect freedom of navigation and free flow of trade. This is the Expert Series.
All right, Tim. So I guess my first question here, the report you recently released, your organization released, noted that Canada is facing increasing security challenges, particularly in the Arctic, with Russian activity and free trade routes in the South China Sea. I wonder if you might be able to just give a brief overview of some of these challenges and why, as the report says, it's an inflection point in Canadian security. If you're able to address that.
Certainly, Josh, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. There's a number of things in the report that are covered at a pretty high level, and this is probably one of them. We wanted to sort of light a bit of a fire under a number of different areas in the report, and this one comes across as one that definitely deserves more attention. Yes, the Russians have been doing things for years in and around the Arctic. We note that the Chinese have also been doing stuff, not just in the Arctic, but all over the Asia Pacific. And for me, it's more like, okay, they're giving us hints as to what they might think about doing, not this year, not next year, but maybe in 4 or 5 or 10 years. And in order to be prepared for that eventuality, that's why Canada needs to do something about its Navy. So I'm thinking along the lines of the way China operates around the Philippines with its fishing fleet. What would happen if they decided to start doing that in the Arctic? They've already built islands and put up infrastructure in the South China Sea areas, and they're reclaiming land, and they're getting pretty forceful in the way they operate. And the rest of the world is not, to my knowledge, at least, there are some of us paying attention to it, but not all of us. And I think the Canadian government needs to wake up to that. So it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow, but it's something that's going to perhaps jump up and bite us in a few years, and we need to be better prepared.
Well, thank you for that scene setter, Tim. I think that's a really great overview to help situate our audience. Now, historically, maybe one could say the military hasn't always strictly been speaking been a traditional priority for Canada for a lot of reasons. We've historically relied on our allies for support for our defense. Why do you think that this is maybe no longer a possibility in the 21st century?
Well, the world is definitely a different place than it was in the 20th century. A lot of things were accomplished in the 20th century through cooperation. There's not the same level of cooperation. There's certainly a degree of isolationism that's creeping in, particularly when we look to our neighbors to the south. I don't know that we can depend on them, particularly the way we've been basically using them and relying on them to support us without any sort of quid pro quo. And I don't think it's going to be there potentially in the next 4 to 8 to 10 years from the United States and from our other allies, because we haven't been pulling our weight. A lot of other NATO countries are pretty conservative. We're obviously in Europe, and they're beefing up and they're spending money. They're reorganizing themselves defensively. They're procuring new equipment, and yet Canada isn't really doing anything. We're not paying attention. So why would they bother supporting us if we're not supporting them?
Well, thank you for those insights, Tim. The report outlines quite a few challenges some people might simply say that the chance of some of these risks we've been discussing in the Arctic in regards to our Navy aren't worth the cost trade-off from other more pressing problems in Canada right now. How do you think these challenges, or why do you think these challenges are worth our immediate attention?
Well, again, it's something that, if we don't react immediately, we won't be prepared in 5 to 10 years. It takes a significant amount of time to build warships. You can activate a navy if it's ready to go, and typically we've done that many times. We did it in World War II. We did it in Korea. We did it in Gulf War One. I participated in off determination, where we had a ship on a NATO deployment that was literally turned around in the middle or off the coast of Portugal and sent back to the Arabian Gulf to conduct an operation for 3 or 4 months. But we had the ships. They were at sea. They were doing the government's business. And we chose to, in this case, divert that particular ship to another mission. We don't have a lot of ships at sea anymore. They're not doing the kinds of things in terms of exercises and operations that we used to do. So, as I say, it becomes a question of timing. You can generate land forces fairly quickly when you need them, but you need to be out the front with your naval forces and have them ready to deploy at not just very quickly, but at a moment's notice. Typically, and I know there's a certain amount of degree of pushback on our paper in terms of what we said about rebalancing the budget of the Canadian Armed Forces towards the Navy and the Air Force. And we said that because, quite frankly, you can deploy the Army when you get it all trained up, and it might take 3 or 4 months to get it operationally ready to deploy to a particular theater of operations. But you can send a ship out, or a task group of ships, if they're ready and if they're available. You can send that task group out in less than a month.
Tim, I'm wondering if we might be able to get a little bit more specific in terms of the Navy. Maybe you could lean on your extensive naval experience. In terms of maybe improving naval capacity, what might you highlight that our Navy needs in order to be functional in the 21st century? What are some of the roadblocks to getting there, and maybe what are some of our capacity needs?
Well, the first thing is we have ships. We have 12 frigates. I don't know exactly how many are in what we used to call a refit, but the capability to deploy them is significantly reduced as compared to what it was in the early to mid 1990s when they were all nice, new, and shiny. We can't deploy a proper task group anymore, which would be 3 or 4 combatants with an auxiliary replenishment vessel with them to fuel them wherever they need to go in the world's oceans. So when we get into that kind of scenario, we need to look at other things that would be a little bit more specific to the particular operation. Now, if we were to send ships over to the South China Sea, well, I'll tell you what, we probably wouldn't, because the ships that we have right now aren't really capable of defending themselves against what they could come up against in the way of a Chinese Navy intent on taking over an island called Taiwan. We wouldn't be very useful over there. And the same applies to the Red Sea and off the coast of Africa and the Middle East, where the Houthi rebels are, firing rockets at ships and taking tankers and other merchant ships and forcing them to divert their passages elsewhere so that they can stay in safe waters. Our ships aren't capable of really defending ourselves, let alone defending a tanker or another warship, because we don't have the surface-to-air missile systems in significant numbers and sufficient capabilities to defend ourselves, as I said, or the merchant ships in the area. And then, of course, submarines. we don't have a submarine fleet that's really deployable in an operational role. We've got 4 boats, but that's not enough to keep them continuously at sea. So there's a number of areas where we need to rebuild ourselves, and those are a few of them.
Tim, I don't know what kind of territory we're about to tread in here, but how likely is it that a current government or a future government might actually implement some of the necessary changes for the Navy? You know, I've talked to a lot of academics on this issue, and sometimes it seems like there's a bit of consensus that we're not going to act unless we absolutely have to and have no other choice. So I'm given the dynamic security environment we find ourselves in, I'm wondering how you would interpret this question.
Well, you could well be right. It's really difficult to get the attention of our political leaders in Canada when it comes to this kind of thing. They seem to suffer from the same kind of maritime blindness that a significant proportion of the population in Canada does, because that population doesn't live anywhere near salt water. They can't smell it. They can't see it. They have really no concept of what navies do and what they're all about. And the successive governments of the day have lost sight of the fact that you need a deterrence factor in order to be somebody who gets listened to on the world stage. And that deterrence factor comes in a globally deployable Navy. So for our governments today, I'm not picking on any particular party, but I think they all, quite frankly, need to wake up and smell the coffee and realize that this 21st century is a lot uglier and a lot meaner than the 20th century was after the end of World War II. And they need to start thinking more seriously about getting Canada capable of providing that deterrence factor and defending itself if and when the time was to come that we have ships from the Chinese government or from the Russian government who decide to come into our waters and start sending their fishing fleets over and that kind of thing.
Yeah, Tim, that was great. I think you provided actually a really excellent overview of some of these issues. Take care, Tim. Thanks again.
You too.
To begin, Canada is facing increasing security challenges, particularly in the Arctic with Russian activity and free trade routes in the South China Sea. Could you give an overview of these rising challenges and why this is an inflection point for Canadian security?
Yeah, I think you got to understand first and foremost that Western-based things are all based on freedom of navigation, what they called it in the 19th century by the British. Basically, it's free trade. So your ships move around the world and take your goods to market, and everyone relies on the fact that your ship sails from wherever with goods. It's going to get to the other destination. No one's going to take it away, and we get to it. So the free flow of trade underpins what Western economies do. The Russians and to I would say more so the Chinese, they represent a challenge because there's a rule-based international order that Western countries seek to preserve, and they see it as a disruption of trade as a way to refine the rules in a way more favorable to autocratic systems of government. And we're seeing that all the time. I mean, remember, Canada is a trading nation. People tend to forget that. The port of Vancouver, the port of Montreal, these are a lot of stuff that goes through there. Okay, in China alone, I was looking at a point yesterday. Former ambassador to China, Canadian ambassador Gisei Rock, who I knew had the privilege of working for him for a number of years when I was in London. He says, just China alone, $31 billion worth of exports went to China. So it's very important that we have the ability to do that and make sure that when stuff goes to market, no one takes away. And so, yeah, it's that. So how do they can disrupt it? We see this right now in the South China Sea. It's been going on for some time. Yes, you have rule-based orders. Yes, you have the UN Convention Law of the Sea, and we all signed up this as wonderful. And then China goes away and says, "Well, no, I'm breaching it. I'm going to build up bases. I don't care what the rules are. We don't agree with that." So we're seeing that if you look at the South China Sea arbitration that's going on, it's been going on for decades. And they're building up bases in the Spratly Islands and say, no, we got all this, notwithstanding that we all agreed to this. China's a signatory on it. No, it's gone away. And as we see recently, there are massive Coast Guard ships going over and on the Philippines, for example. To quote them, they're very disruptive. It's a nice way, aggravate the situation. But it's not just China. It's Russia does the same thing, and take a look what I don't know if you read the news clips this morning, but intelligence are saying that the Russians are contemplating giving the Hutus anti-ship missiles. Well, that's just wonderful. So that Red Sea is a choke point. Why? Because that's a Suez Canal. If you don't go through there, you have to go around the Cape of Good Hope, which adds about another, depending on where you're going, 10 days to 2 weeks. So stuff doesn't, a whole supply system that's based on just enough, just in time. No, that's you're disrupting it, particularly in Europe. Not so much more for North America because of the way it goes around there, but still, it's a major disruptive. And insurance rates going up. Countries are not going to send their ships through if they're going to get hit by missiles, and as we're seeing right now. So those are the sort of things they can do and are doing, and we should watch that where we're going. I guess my final point on this one is this is not just a Canadian security problem; it's a worldwide one, and all our allies have woken up to it and said, "Guys, this is really bad. We got to do something." Yeah, and look at just going to Pacific. I mean, RIMPAC, the Rim Pacific exercise that come up every 2 years. All I'm saying is, look, all the Europeans are in there. I mean, really? You got the Dutch in there. You got the Italians got an aircraft carrier down in the South Pacific. I mean, the Germans are in there. They participated and other things off, sanctions off North Korea and everything. What we call Operation Neon in Canada. But everybody's waking up to it, and I think we have a responsibility as a trading nation to do our bit. And you can't just simply say, "Hey, I really want my goods to get to market." Navies protect that, and they've been doing it. Let's face it, the modern Navy was defined in the 1600s because a city of London was tired of all the goods coming across and getting privateers taken in the English Channel, and it's about there. So that's where the modern British Royal Navy stood up as a professional force, and that's what you do.
Could you outline the growing importance of the Navy? Why, in the particular context of great power competition, as mentioned in the report, will the challenges we're facing be increasingly based in our seas? And what will the challenges and consequences be to Canada if it fails to revamp its Navy, particularly in our relationship to the US and other allies?
Well, let me take it apart bit by bit here, okay? Let's talk about what consequences Canada failed to revamp its Navy, particularly in relationship to U.S. and other allies, because we're looking strictly Navy. But I think the answer now is continual marginalization. Okay, everyone's all hurt. Oh my God, they didn't invite us to join AUKUS. Oh, woe is me. And I call it an EOR concept if you understand Winnie the Pooh, and sort of thing. But I mean, we could be kicked out of the G7. Remember, the G7. The only reason Canada was brought into the G7 was by President Ford to get away from these big European blocs brought Canada in. But if you're not schlepping up to the table and doing your full thing, why isn't Australia in the G7 then? Okay, we look at size of economies, we judge that, but that would be that I think is the some of the things you're going. But basically, the continual marginalization. You want trade, Canada? Go do something, and that's certainly what happened to. If you look at the equipment we have today in our armed forces, so the legacy fleets of your F-18 aircraft, your Halifax class frigates, your Royal and Maritime Patrol aircraft, and your Leopard tanks. Those are all bought by the current Prime Minister's father when he got told, put some money in there or no trade. And Pierre Trudeau got that loud and clear. So we're leaving on that one. So the answer is, you want to do this? You want trade? You want this to happen? Okay. And I would think that those that letter from a bunch of senators and so like Mitt Romney not saying, hey, and Americans have always been very careful how they couch their words and they're very diplomatic. That's telling you pay attention. It doesn't matter what political ilk the government and the next administration is in the United States of America. Canada's going to step up. All of a sudden, we're going to continue to have problems with trade agreements and that. Okay, so they are putting a lot of money in defense and have been for years. So they want that. I would say one thing I always thought with the Americans, having spent a lot of time in NATO, and I was told this: it's not what you've done, it's not what you're doing, it's what you're going to do with the Americans. And we've been, dare I say, capricious. So you never know. Well, we're there, then we're not. There was a time you could rely on Canada always being there. And the Navy, during all the Cold War, the standing naval force, always had a Canadian frigate in. Always. Okay. And then we stopped. We're maybe this, maybe that. No, they can't rely on you anymore. Canada, you're great. You're going to show up, sort of thing. To remember, too, that for the Americans, defense of North America is number one. That's no kidding. Okay. That's the thing. So what do you need? Well, take a look at a map. Stand back. You need a really big Air Force and a Navy, okay? Because that's what's going to protect it. And failing to, I say, adequately support continental defense will impact Canada's trade with the U.S., okay? And therefore the economy. It gets back to what I said earlier. It's the economy. Bill Clinton said that. Yeah. And remember what happens when you get into this, trade reduction leads to lower dollar figure. It all ties in there and everything like that. And eventually, again, I was reading a piece by Perrin Beatty put in the National Post on the weekend, saying, talking to then Admiral Thomas when he was the defense minister, you'll get what you can afford to pay. So if Canada wants to be sovereign, go away and do something. And there's going to be things we want to do that not necessarily agrees with the United States of America. That's fine. A sovereign nation goes away to about 99% of the stuff. Yeah, we agree. So you got to have the ability to act in your own sovereignty. You can't if you don't do that. So someone else will step in, okay? Because they're not going to let you have the back door open, if you like. But I think to greater importance to the Navy, I think it's worthwhile looking at history. Certainly, great power challenges have always been based on the sea. Go back hundreds of years. Whether it's the Portuguese, it's the Spanish, it's the Dutch, it's the English, French. What's going on? Well, it's about moving stuff around by sea and control of trade routes and everything like that and things. So I think what we see now is we've seen that we're shifted from a Eurocentric world to an Asia Pacific. So is there that much of a chance of, certainly the Europeans got to worry about the Russians coming in and that sort of goes back to the Soviet times with land invasion and everything like that. And that was the thought. Remember, the Cold War was all those forces were over there as a bit of a tripwire until we could get folks over there from North America and getting the people and the equipment. And that was basic what the Navy's role was. Get out there, get battle the Atlantic, we're going to get across the Atlantic, we're going to get there in a supporting role. Well, that's changed. So if you look at the history of the Second World War in the Pacific, there's a lot of water and some islands. It's a naval air war. So you're going to need to have air forces and you're going to need to have navies to get them there. And that's why the shift has really happened. So it's become a de facto maritime conflict in the Asia Pacific. It always has been, simply because of massive size. You take a look how long it takes to get to Hawaii, which is not even halfway across, compared to that to getting across the Atlantic. I mean, I would say the other thing too is remember too is what's your biggest threat? And we all go on about this, that, and the other thing like that. If you look at strictly from a military context, the homeland defense, the biggest threat has been missile firing submarines. Okay, we talked about that in the Cold War. The ballistic missiles going on. You can predict ballistic missile launches. There's ways of doing it. The biggest threat nowadays is the cruise missile firing one because they aren't necessarily a lot closer, and it's maneuvering, and you don't have the time to get it, and you've got to assume that it's got a nuclear tip on it. So Russian submarines or Chinese submarines coming off our coasts, that is the threat. That's the one that's going to hit the homeland, okay, and take the fight to Canada. So we're no longer this, they're over there, don't worry about it, they're not going to come. Oh, yes, they are. And now. So this means that we need to have aircraft and ships and submarines that are capable of detecting and engaging missile firing submarines, okay, before they launch. Should they manage to achieve a launch, then we need to have the ability to take out those missiles in flight. And that's what Aegis will give you in the new River class destroyers, and that's certainly what the Americans do. Having NORAD looking at the overall picture, but you have ships out there that have the ability to intercept the incoming missiles, and that's why you really need a Navy on that one.
To sort of shift topics a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the report now, if that's all right.
Mhm.
So, the report outlines several reasons why Canada's Navy is not cut out to meet these challenges that you've mentioned. Could you give a brief summary as to what capacity challenges facing the Navy today are, both personnel and fleet wise?
I would say that first and foremost, submarines. Okay, modern navies, regardless of size, field credible submarine force. Everyone's doing it. Amazing little nations in the Asia Pacific, they're all getting submarines. Everyone's doing it. Okay, so Canada, as you know, is defined by geography, which makes it more difficult than other small navies because we have to defend 3 oceans. Okay? Now, I won't get into things of getting under ice, but you get into the choke points where they come out of ice. Okay, so it's up there. We simply don't have enough submarines. No matter what you think of the Victoria class, it matters not. The issue is we simply don't have enough submarines to do that. And so we need to have a class submarine capability on both coasts, which means you need to have a sufficient amount of ocean-going submarines. And the issue there, most of the nations are archipelago and things, but even the Europeans, okay, it's small's good because, take a look at the Baltic. The average depth of water in the Baltic is 54 meters. That's shallow. Trust me. But even so, you can take a look at where they are, whether it's in the North Sea, the Baltic, or even the Mediterranean. They can be in close, and you design submarines you require. That's why they are. Well, Canada is huge, and the distance it takes to go, say, from Halifax up north to where we patrols is like going to UK, and on the west coast is even more. It's crazy. So you need big ocean-going submarines with legs. Now, historically, that's submarines outside your nuclear power. We're not going to do that. So you need to have those submarines. So, and we need to have enough of them that you constantly have some out all the time. Okay, and it's everyone that runs submarines will tell you the same thing. If you take a look at the UK, they have 4 ballistic missile submarines. Why? So you get one out all the time. The French have 4 ballistic missile submarines. Why? So you get one out all the time. That's in one geographical area. Okay, the Americans actually have more, 2 So you use a 4-to-1 rule. There's days you're going to have more than that out, but if you wanted to guarantee one out, so that's how you start driving the numbers game. And it's the old adage, like I said, it's like you say, it's the more is the better. You get economies of scale and set up. And that's what we need first and foremost. Surface fleet, I think the reality of today, and we're seeing, it's going to be able to defend itself from an omnipresent missile threat. At the same time, working absolutely seamlessly with allies, because you're not going to be out on your own. Okay, so but you got to be able to defend yourself, because the last thing you want to show up the game and everyone's going to protect you so that you could be there. No, that's things. If you take a look at the Red Sea, what's happening right now, the number of missiles. So people don't understand, we missed a generation. Typically, a warship is about 20 years, 25 years. Okay. By the time we get rid of the Halifax class, they're going to be 45 up to 50. We did the same with the Iroquois class, 25. We pushed them to 45 years old. Okay. This is crazy. So when you build it, I still remember when Halifax class came into service. Everyone's going, oh my God, you're so big compared to our other ones. Look at all the missiles, you're over scoping it. Well, trust me right now, they're not. You only have 16 missiles, surface air missiles in a Halifax class frigate. That and the ways you see what's happening in the Red Sea right now, they're going through missiles real fast. And that's reality of today. And Americans say missile tubes. You look at a typical Arleigh Burke class destroyer has 96 missile tubes. Okay, that's not enough. And that's so you get to stay alive. And that's why we need to be looking at doing that. And the problem is it takes so long to get there. This looks like a good requirement. We haven't cut steel yet. okay, maybe we need more. Okay, the next batch are going to have more. And that's what Admiral Topsy was talking about they announced the river class thing. The first three will be at this, and then it'll be spiral developing and more and more. But that's what it is. It's a missile game. I think the other thing that the challenges, of course, is always sea time, getting the ships off the wall and thing, so you're ready for tomorrow. It, I said, someone who's deliver all these ships we want tomorrow. What are we going to do with it? You got to train up crews, and people understand that crew is made up of a whole bunch of people. And the Halifax class frigate with the air net marked, they're now sailing about 245, 250 people. Now the core of the crew is about 200. So all those are different people with different the French use terms, a métier, occupational and levels of expertise, and all certified at different levels. You just don't go away and say, I'm going to fire some missiles. You have to be certified to do that. The weapon system has to be groomed and everything like that. That takes time, I think, and not experience. So, I joined the Navy in the mid 70s, 76, and I took command of a frigate in 1999. And I was on point for the average. Absolutely. Okay. It just takes that much time to do the jobs, go the experience, so you can be the captain, and then very well now. So how do you grow that? You get people to go to sea and get sea time. Okay. The problem is we've left it too late. Okay. So we got to get out there and do the operations and simultaneously training our crews. It's the only way you can do it. It's not, even the RCMP can go town and hire someone to be a police officer. Okay, there's people out there with police experience, not in the Navy. Anyway, you have to homegrow your own. Okay, and if they don't exist, how do you get a guy with 10 years experience? A guy with 10 years, and that's where you get. So what does this mean? It means it translates into more money for maintenance. So we get those ships out because they're really old. It's like anything else. You got a car and you decide you're not going, the warranty's up and everything's going to cost. Are you going to buy a new car or are you going to just run the rail? Well, that's a decision point. So guess what? I'm not having to make a car payment. That these days, when I take it in the shop, it's expensive and it's coming out. And every day that goes on, it gets more progressively more expensive, of course. So there's always that sweet spot when you look at really a defense budget, really oversimplification, say 60% is people, and you're not going to be paying people less. That's your training and everything like that. Schoolhouses, all that infrastructure goes with it. 20% is you should be doing capital according to the NATO rules minimum. Okay, that leaves you 20% for O&M maintenance. But if you decide not to spend that capital, you're now dipping into your capital fund to maintain it, and that's where it's expensive. Because guess what? Yeah, no one's built that part years ago. We bought spares with the Halifax class designed for 25 years. Well, guess what? They're over 30 years old now. We got $1.99. It certainly did work, but going back to original equipment manufacturing, well, we don't make that anymore. Other companies gone out of business, or that was never designed to be replaced. So you're ripping it all out. I think the other thing too with that is we talked about people. So you got to get the maintenance done on ships so they get out to sea so people could do operations, get the training and everything like that. But we also need to recruit people, okay? And we need to retain people, okay? And this is where and this is what the report is leaning on and is saying about, okay? Nice language, but the answer is the one-size-all system that we have where all personnel issues in the Canadian Forces are handled by one area, Chief Military Personnel. I'm sorry, to train a ship's company of a ship is much different than it is a battalion of soldiers, okay? That's not because one's right or wrong. It's just completely different beastie. And so we need to tailor our recruiting to what the Navy needs, okay, for naval things. Also, we're retention things that may not make a lot of sense to some guy in the Army. Remember that the Army, to a certain extent, the Air Force, they get posted out to weird places, okay? And there's not a lot of infrastructure, there's a lot of housing going there. They got to do that. Well, Canada, like most navies in the world, big sea cities. So it's Squamble, Victoria on the west coast, and it's Halifax on the east coast. Well, that's great. Housing there and everything. The issue there, though, it's expensive. So if you come in there and you have to buy a, how are you going to do that? That's a different dynamic. How can we do that to address unique retention problems faced by sailors that would necessarily be different than soldiers and and aviators? Those are the sort of things that they're going on that are challenging now. And of course, the Navy is the smallest of the three, and so it doesn't make oh, it's just for some people, but you got to do it. We got to build it up because we lost a lot of positions over the years. When we basically, the whole idea of ships is the new one comes in, the crew, you always constantly stand aside. But we've been what we call paying off or decommissioning ships without a release, and the positions then die. They go back to the vice chief of defense staff, which means you can't recruit into that anymore. All of a sudden, it's a smaller thing, so you can't recruit in. There's less people to train because you can't recruit them. Why? Because you don't have those ships. But we're going to get those ships on us. Yeah, I'll give you the positions when the new ships arrive. Well, that's no good. How am I supposed to have the crews ready to go? And so you're robbing from Peter to pay Paul, and it's just not an optimal system. But it looks good from a big picture thing. But it just never has worked for the Navy. I'm going back to the 1960s, and that's always been that way.
I've really enjoyed your analysis, and we've covered a lot of great ground today. Thank you very much for your time today. We really enjoyed having you on and hope to have you on again soon.
Happy to help. It's important that we get the message out, people understand here's the truth of it all. But we need to get moving in that general direction, and we need to make sure for Canada that we have our allies behind us.
Thank you for that excellent end to this podcast. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
My pleasure.
So, to begin, in the report, you've outlined several reasons why Canada's Navy is not cut out to meet these current challenges. Could you give a brief summary as to what the main capacity challenges facing the Navy are today, both personnel and fleet-wise?
Of course, the Canadian Navy is facing many of the same problems that our allied navies are facing around the world. The first, as you said, is personnel, human resources, recruitment, retention, and even, of course, training and maintaining the personnel that we have. That is a serious crisis. Even if we were to triple the fleet tomorrow with new ships wished out of thin air, we couldn't crew them. So that is first and foremost the main challenge facing the Navy. We need to rebuild, strengthen, and maintain the force that we have and the force for the future. Along with that, and in many ways, it's a cyclical requirement, we need to rebuild the capital fleet. So we need new ships. The CESCs, or now the River class destroyers, are being built, but we're looking at a multi-decade timeline to actually have them in service in numbers to replace the Halifax class, which are not appropriate to a modern high-intensity combat environment. Now, at the same time, as you know, we're also looking to replace submarines. Promises of an ambiguous nature have been made. We will see what comes of that. But again, you look at the human resource capacity, we don't have the crews right now, I don't think, for even 3 submarines, maybe 2 at best. So we're looking at 10 submarines. Again, where do we build them? How fast can we get them? We need them yesterday to replace the Victoria class, and then we need to find a way to crew them. We are also replacing the Kingston class patrol ships, which are at the end or near the end of their service life. But we're looking at a different, as I said, global dynamic where we have to make tough decisions about whether or not we want to replace them with patrol ships built to civilian standards, or if the Navy needs a light corvette or something with a little bit more in the way of teeth. So at the same time as we are trying to fundamentally change our recruitment and retention problems and structures, we're also recapitalizing the entire fleet.
The military hasn't traditionally been a priority for Canada, and as you've noted, we've historically relied on our allies to support our defense. Why do you think that this is no longer a possibility in the 21st century?
Well, it was no longer a possibility in the 20th century, and there were large stretches of time where the Canadian government, the Canadian people, did take these obligations very seriously. You look at Canada's contribution to the 2 world wars, to Korea, significant investments in defense capacity in the 1950s and the 1960s. Even in the 1970s and 80s, you look at what the Canadian Armed Forces put forward. It may not have been what we should have been, but it was still at least more of an honest effort than what we're seeing today. Canadians, however, have always thought of themselves as living in a fireproof house, as Raoul Dandurand put it. It makes sense. We have three large oceans between us and potential enemies. We have the United States sitting right below us with a vested interest in our security. Simply put, it's easy to allow others to defend us. It's cheap, and we have historically gotten away with it. Now, there's a few things that are changing, of course. And the first is that modern technology is eliminating some of the barriers, the moats that we've relied on historically. It's no longer weeks to cross an ocean. It's no longer even a couple of hours to cross an ocean. Modern hypersonic weapons can get from Russia to the United States through Canada, or of course to Canada itself, in a matter of minutes. We're now looking at, as I said, different challenges from different directions. We're also looking at allies that are less and less content to let Canada freeload. And that's going to have ramifications, implications on all kinds of different areas, from trade to diplomatic soft power. The Europeans and the Americans in particular, who are now coughing up, for the most part, 2% of GDP, are going to be much more disinclined to simply allow Canada to continue to skate on spending 1.5% of our GDP.
What do you think the consequences would be if Canada fails to revamp its Navy, particularly in our relationship with the US and our other allies that you've mentioned?
Well, there are all kinds of political consequences that are difficult to foresee and even harder to quantify. Once again, as I said, many of these consequences are going to manifest outside of the obvious defense environment. Canada is going to be taken less seriously. We are going to be seen, either consciously or unconsciously, more and more as a dependency. And the Americans and our European allies will increasingly treat us this way. We are going to lose credibility. We are going to lose our ability to push forward initiatives on all kinds of issues unrelated to defense, simply because of how we're being perceived as a freeloader and as less of a serious um, uh, partner in the defense of the Western world order. Now, more practically and immediately, I think the Americans are going to move more and more. If we fail to secure our own sea lanes and our own coasts, the Americans will move more and more to take that defense on themselves. And increasingly, as the Americans defend the Atlantic, the Arctic, and Pacific lanes into Canada, Canada will understandably lose influence. We will lose the ability to determine how that defense is undertaken. We're going to lose access to intelligence. We are going to lose control over our own defense. That's something I don't think any Canadian government of any political stripe is anxious to see happen.
What do you think our main political challenges have been in getting military more funding that it needs to prevent these issues from occurring, and why has this area been historically underprioritized?
Well, at least since the 1990s, the deprioritization of military spending has been understandable. Across the 90s, the early 2000s, from the Kretchen into the Harper years, yeah, it may have been short sighted, but you can at least grasp what the prime ministers were thinking. China was widely viewed as a powerful up and coming country, but one that we could work with. This was a partner, maybe a trading adversary, but it wasn't necessarily considered a military and defense threat, at least until Xi Jinping took over and began to change Chinese policy in that regard. Likewise, Russia was seen as not necessarily a friend, but a country that was at least predictable. Now, the Canadian governments, and of course the Canadian people, which elect them, were happy to deprioritize defense because defense is one of the single largest discretionary lines. I believe it is the largest discretionary line in the Canadian budget. It's an easy thing to cut. Whether you are a conservative government looking to balance the budgets, or a Kretchen liberal government, or whether you're sort of a modern government looking to spend more. It was just an easy win to take that money away. Now, what has happened, however, is it's done long-term structural damage. We put off things like F-35s, the Canadian surface combatants, submarines. We've put things off so long that they now cost more. We are not going to have them in time. And we're faced with the reality that either today we double down and expedite the process, and that is going to cost more, or we accept that we will not have these assets and these capabilities when we need them most, which is going to be, quite frankly, now and over the next 10 years.
The report outlines several suggestions for where funding should be applied to improve our naval capacity. But could you highlight exactly what our Navy needs to be able to do in order to be a functional 21st century Navy and how exactly we can achieve that?
We're making some good progress now, of course. The River class destroyers are being built. These are much larger, much more capable than Halifax class. In particular, they bring an area air defense capability, which the Halifax class were not designed for. So we are building that capability. One of the problems is it's just it takes a very long time. And so one of the big questions is how does Irving and the Canadian government accelerate the process? Now, based on their announcements recently on the launch of the construction, that seems to be what they want to do. They are looking for ways to bring these ships forward as quickly as possible. But it takes a long time to build a large, complex warship. So we need to keep working to figure out how we accelerate the build. We also need submarines, as I said, to replace the Victoria class before their end of life. And we need them. There isn't a date I can give you. The date I would say is today. I mean, 2035 is discussed as end of life, but quite frankly, most of the Victoria class are past their truly useful life expectancy. And both the Victorias and the Halifax class are now seeing such increased maintenance requirements that they're becoming inefficient to maintain. We need those submarines right away. So we need them as soon as possible. And what that means is working with foreign builders that are able to deliver not only quality platforms that fit Canada's requirements, but deliver them quickly. And that's one of the things I think the Canadian government needs to look at, not just what is the platform, where is it coming from, but when can we get it? Some of these submarines are probably, some of these submarine designs from some countries are probably better fits for that than others. But that has to be one of the questions the Canadian government puts forward is what is the fastest delivery time possible?
If you had to choose, what would be the most immediate change you'd make with our currently available resources to improve the state of the Navy?
Well, that's a big question. And I think the answer is our currently available resources aren't sufficient to make any big changes. I think the answer is we need significantly more resources. If I were to answer in terms of structural change, not buying new things, but changing policy, changing methods and operational dynamics, I think the answer you would get from most defense analysts is we need to change our procurement policy. This isn't about spending more money on this and that. It is, but it's not just that. It's about spending that money much, much better. Canada has an atrocious record of defense procurement. We procure very slowly. It's a very convoluted process. It is it is so complicated that it takes so long that by the time we've procured anything, inflation has eaten away half of our budget. So one of the things we need to get better at, and we can get better at right now, is procuring faster, treating the modern security dynamic as more of an emergency, maybe using our procurement for Ukraine as a bit of a template. So we have been able to procure weapons systems for Ukraine very, very quickly. We were able to procure systems for our troops in Afghanistan, for instance, very, very quickly because it was an emergency. It was recognized that there were some hoops that could be skipped. I think we need to undergo a fundamental rethink on how we get equipment for the soldiers. And I think that's probably the first thing any defense analyst would tell you, something we could do right now, something that should be politically possible.
Well, I've really enjoyed your analysis, and we've covered a lot of excellent ground today. But before we go, do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Sure. As you said earlier, we are at a little bit, I shouldn't say a little bit, that's an understatement. We are absolutely at an inflection point. We are looking at a fundamentally altered geopolitical landscape, something which Very few Canadians would have seen coming 3 years ago. Perhaps we should have, but we did not. And I think it is a huge error to treat this as a passing crisis, as something that can be wished away, as something that the Americans will take care of. As a sovereign state, Canada needs to manage its own defense. And more than that, we need to contribute to global stability. We need to contribute to allied deterrence because we derive so much security from NATO. The idea that we are not contributing to the broader collective defense pot is insulting to us, and it is something that ultimately is going to be self-defeating.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really enjoyed having you on the podcast and hope to have you on another episode again soon.
Happy to be here. Take care.
That's all for today's episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you, and we hope you'll be tuning in next time.